These are the differences that I've noticed between teaching in a primary school in England and teaching in Australia. The first main difference is marking. In England, teachers are expected to do a lot of marking. Generally every day you'll have at least one set of 30 books to mark.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Usually there are lots of policies regarding marking, so maybe different coloured pens, maybe you have to say 2 positives and a thing to improve. Lots of schools have different things, but generally they want quite in-depth marking quite often in England. In Australia, I've noticed that they don't really expect you to do much marking in comparison. They still have to do some marking and check things, but in general there's lots of peer assessments, and there seems to be a general understanding that marking isn't learning. You can move on learning from discussions with children or just from looking at the work and then talking to them. It's not something that there's a big emphasis for. And obviously marking has such a big impact on the rest of school life, what you spend your time doing. So generally teachers don't seem as rushed or stressed because of this, because marking has such a massive impact on everything else.
That's exactly correct.
Next difference, class sizes. In England, generally, classes are about 30 children. In Australia, or in Melbourne so far, most classes are around 22 to 24 children, and you really notice the difference. That's like a whole table of children gone.
That's a good point. It is a good point.
Admittedly, in England, most classes would maybe have a TA at some points to help support the 30 children, whereas here they don't have TAs as so much. They have some support officers, but they're not as common. The smaller class sizes make a big difference, really noticeable. And overall, I think that gives you more time to actually talk to each of the children and work with them individually and understand what they need, which I think is positive. It's for the better, really. Just check I'm going the right way. Another thing I've noticed compared to home is the timetable for the day. Generally here, they seem to have a very long morning session and then a recess and then another fairly long session, and then they have lunch in their classrooms for about 10 minutes. They eat with their teacher in the classroom, which is different, but it's quite a nice experience. You get to know what the children are eating, and it's not the hardest thing. And then they have lunch, and because they've had such a long morning, generally afternoon sessions are shorter, so you only spend like an hour with the kids in the afternoon, which I really prefer. At home, not in every school, but a lot of schools I've been in, you tend to have an hour and a half to 2 hours in the afternoon with the kids, with no recess or break. So the afternoons really drag. The children aren't focused as much in the afternoons. In both countries, children switch off a bit in the afternoons. They're aware of that here, and so the afternoon sessions are shorter, which makes perfect sense to me. And that last point, eating with the teacher, brings me on to something else. So the next one is adult involvement and roles outside of the classroom. They don't seem to have hired lunchtime duty staff. Seems to be teachers are expected to do a lot more break duties and a lot more lunch duties. They're pretty consistent in every school. They always have high-vis jackets for people who are on duty and a bag full of medical supplies. They're never really longer than 15 minutes at first recess or half an hour at lunchtime. Whereas in England, it's a union right that teachers get 1 hour free at lunchtime. But I would much rather be out in the playground watching kids than having to do all the marking we're expected to do in England. There's also duties after school, keeping an eye on the gate and things like that. Next one, bells between lessons and PA announcements. In England, in the schools I've been in, I think some have bells that signal that the end of one lesson happens and the next one begins.
Oh, and I will be
But I've not been in many that do. Here, every school I've been in has a bell that rings digitally through the school PA system and signifies the next lesson. And I think that really helps you be tight with timetabling, because in schools in England, sometimes it's just expected the teacher stops at 10 o'clock and then moves on to the next lesson. But in reality, teachers go, oh, we'll just spend a bit longer here, or they don't notice the time, or things like that. Whereas a bell is a good prompt because the children generally enforce it themselves as well, saying we need to move on to whatever's timetabled. And also the sound system gets used for announcements by head teachers and senior leaders.
Attention, this is an emergency broadcast. All is well in the school.
Which seems a much better system than the ones I'm aware of in England, which is getting some year sixes to pass out notes. The next difference I've noticed is general behaviour towards teachers and attitude. In England, I think we've got some sort of hang-ups from the Victorian era. We're very strict in a lot of ways.
Silence! You girls stop that chattering. And all of you, take to your seats immediately!
There's a lot of standing in lines and quietly putting fingers on lips, and lots of silence expected in England. In Australia, they don't do so much of that, so different schools seem to have different expectations, but generally there's a lot more sort of chatter allowed between classrooms. There's less sort of formal silent lining up, and they're sort of okay with them chatting in assemblies. It was strange for me being in a class assembly and the kids were just chatting, and in England this would be a big tell them to stop, tell them to listen, but here it was very relaxed and they were just, yeah, they're just having a chat. Let them have a chat as long as they're not too noisy. And then between lessons they're allowed to have sort of a chat, you know, they don't have to walk in a perfect line, they just sort of clump along in little groups having a little gossip. But I would say, so as a teacher, I prefer having to not enforce ridiculous standards of silence all the time, because adults don't seem to be able to stick to it. Teachers are always chatting, so. But I have noticed that children don't seem to have the same reverence of adults that they have back home.
Bored.
Hey, listen, you know, if we're all bored over here, wouldn't the common denominator be you?
They talk to you with less respect in general.
What did you say?
I'm sorry. Actually, what I said was...
They sort of treat you like you're... And this might be because I'm a supply, or CRT they call them out here. They're more relaxed and informal when talking to adults, which has its downsides because they don't seem to respect requests for things to be done so much. I've had children saying, do I have to do that? Why do I have to do that?
It's time for the quiz. Yeah, you know what? Oh, too bad. Tough.
Which in England you'd really not get very much. Whereas here they feel relaxed around adults to the point that they just say what's on their mind. So pros and cons to that one. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has found this between the two countries. Next, curriculum. Now, children in Australia are older in each year because their school year runs from January to December, or late January till mid-December. So the children are a bit older already in each year group. You get 12-year-olds in year 6, etc. And also, what's expected of them seems lower than England. So a year 6 child here compared to a year 6 child in England, I would say, particularly with grammar and maths, less is expected of them. They don't need to know so many grammatical devices, all the technical terms, sort of algebra, all the new stuff we've introduced in the 2014 curriculum in England that's harder, they haven't got here. Everything the children are learning here feels more gettable, it feels more achievable, and therefore everyone is less stressed, I think. I've found teaching things out here, you don't feel you're expecting too much of them, whereas in England sometimes you're trying to teach them things and you're aware that adults don't know this very well and that this is really stretching them. And I can understand having a high standard and expecting a lot, but all that high expectation sort of has to get absorbed by the teacher. Children are no different because there's a high expectation, but the teacher is having to do a lot more heavy lifting, and it adds up. So the curriculum out here, I would say, is generally easier. The next one is GDPR. Now, if you don't know, GDPR is the data protection rules, rights, laws that came into effect in 2019. And it basically revolves around you can't make a child identifiable in any way in a class. It was vague, but that was basically translated as no names up in classrooms, no date of births, medical alerts are sort of half hidden, although they're an alert. Here, that doesn't exist. I've been in classrooms where part of their uniform is their jersey, and on the jersey is their entire class list, including surnames, which wouldn't be allowed at home for sure. In England as well, parents are told not to film class assemblies and sports days, things like that, in case the footage goes online, and to protect children who haven't consented to being online or safeguard children. Here that doesn't seem to exist either. I was in an assembly and the principal said, come up, sit at the front, film the assembly, get everything you want out of it. I think it makes more sense to allow it because it happened at home regardless of if they were allowed or not. Just try and enforce a sensible approach to what they do with the footage and the photos. And those are the main differences I've noticed between the two countries. Obviously I've not been everywhere. Lots of schools vary. In general, I think teaching is respected more here. Teachers have to do a certain amount of professional development by going on courses, etc. every year, or they lose their registration as a teacher. Whereas at home, you're sort of expected to do professional development, but there's no minimum requirement. So generally it doesn't happen as much because teachers are aware it costs the school money. Teachers feel very self-aware of leaving their class to someone else for a day. So it sort of gets put to the side a bit sometimes. And generally, I think teachers are happier out here. They seem to have less of a problem about retaining them. On the flip side, it's way harder to get a job out here, which is why I'm doing casual relief teaching instead of a full-time job somewhere. But yeah, I'll be interested to know if anyone else has noticed differences between the two countries. Feel free to comment, let me know.
Class dismissed.
Talk to you all soon.